Hello and welcome to Guns and Gear. You know, I've been in kind of a revolver mood lately, and I thought this might be a good time to talk about one of my very favorite handgun cartridges, and that's the 41 Remington Magnum. You know, 41 has actually hasn't had the popularity that I really believe that it should, because it is an outstanding round, both in the field and if loaded properly for self-defense. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit about the beginnings, and these three guns that I have in front of you today are three Smith & Wessons. They're all model 57s, and talk about you know, some of the offerings that are out there. Okay, now the word Magnum was first associated with a pistol cartridge with a 357 Magnum, and that, to my knowledge, and that was the mid-30s when they came out with the 357 Magnum. Now the original load for that was a 158 grain load, and you know, it was actually promoted as a more powerful police cartridge. Okay, but because the ammunition hadn't caught up with the power of that load, because of cross-sectional density and all these other scientific ways that we use to measure how good a bullet is nowadays, the 357 Magnum was still lacking. Okay, now 20 years later they came out with the 44 Magnum, and that was touted as an absolute outstanding field cartridge and hunting cartridge, but too powerful and too big a gun for law enforcement. Okay, so what was needed was something in the middle. Okay, and a couple of guys that I've read many articles and things about the 41 Magnum, and you know, sometimes people bring in all these different individuals from the time period, but it was around in 1963 or so, from what I have read, Elmer Keith, who also has been given a lot of credit for the 44 Magnum, and Bill Jordan, who was an accomplished shooter and a law enforcement officer, approached both Remington and Smith & Wesson about building a new police cartridge, a new defensive cartridge that would also be good in the field, and I'll explain more about that. What they wanted was the 41 Magnum. Now, in the beginning, and from their concept, okay, what they wanted was two basic offerings coming out for the 41 Magnum. One of them being a 210 grain bullet that was moving at 1,500 feet per second. Now that's pretty respectable, and that would make an excellent hunting or field cartridge. All right, but they also wanted a 200 grain offering that only moves at around 900 feet per second range. Okay, and that was to be the police or law enforcement or defensive offering. Okay, now what Smith & Wesson ended up doing was taking their 44 Magnum and just drilling in some smaller holes. Okay, and instead of and created what we have today as the Model 57. All right, and to make a gun for the law enforcement officers, they basically had a beefed up Model 10 or it's a Model 29 with fixed sights, and called it the Model 58. Okay, and that's just a fixed sight revolver for law enforcement. The problem was for law enforcement was when Remington first came out with the first loadings, they used the same 210 grain bullet, and they just downloaded it to about 1,100, 1,200 feet per second. All right, and that turned out to be just a little bit too much bang, too much power to make for a good police round. And in that big heavy gun, the two models that they had, the 57 and the 58, it never took off like it could have. And there again, you also had the readers, not the readers, but the writers and stuff at the time. They never really hopped on board with it either. This has always been a cartridge that I consider one that could have been, but just never was. The 44 Magnum from the inception was an excellent idea. But it never really took off as a law enforcement cartridge. Now, there are some law enforcement agencies, especially from what I gather, rural law enforcement agencies, that took on the Model 57s and Model 58s because sometimes those officers are asked to dispatch animals that's been hit by vehicles and things of that nature, and the more powerful round was well suited for that. And as a hunting cartridge, I think it is excellent. You know, there's a lot of proponents for the .44 Magnum. And nowadays we have, you know, 454 Casull. My gosh, we have the Linball cartridges, 475 and 500. You got the great big 460 and 500 Smith & Wesson Magnums. You have these monster rounds, and they come with monster guns. And to be honest with you, in my opinion, in the areas that I hunt here in Virginia, you don't really get to enjoy what those guns can offer. Nor do you need the power that those guns offer for what I hunt, which is basically deer, black bear, and feral hog. Okay? These are, the feral hog and the black bear can be a large animal and it's very dense tissue. But I tell you what, I've hunted a lot with .44 Magnums and I've hunted a lot with .41 Magnums, and I've never really been able to tell the difference in the wound of the animals that I've shot with them. And the .41 Magnum, it has a lot less recoil. So as a hunting cartridge, I think it is absolutely excellent. Now I have 3 guns on the table, might as well show them off a little bit. The first one I'll show you, and I got these not only in order of barrel length, but also happens to be in order of how I bought them. This was my first .41 Magnum Smith & Wesson. Actually, the very first .41 Magnum I ever owned was a Ruger Red Hawk with a 7.5 inch barrel. But this is a Model 57 with an 8 3/8 inch barrel. And it is an excellent gun. And as a hunting weapon, I tell you what, I've really enjoyed using this over the years. Now, I believe this, and this is a 57-2, if I'm not mistaken. Let me look here. I'm sorry, this is a 57-1. Okay, now the second gun is actually older, but I didn't get it until maybe, I don't know, 15 or so years ago. This is a Smith & Wesson Model 57 no dash, and this also has the recessed cylinders, okay, cylinder holes that, you know, is often the case for some of the older Smith & Wesson handguns. Now, the .41 Magnum, and I don't know if I said this earlier, was introduced, I think, in 1964, and you started seeing them around 65 with, you know, seeing them around the gun shops or so, and that's going by my father, who was a slow convert, but he became a convert. He absolutely loved the .44 Magnum, and it took him a while to swing on by and try the .41 Magnum out. Now, the last handgun that I have here is the one that I got not that long ago. This is the 57 Mountain Gun edition, and that's because it has a tapered barrel. Okay. Now, as far as none of these guns are light, of course, but with that tapered barrel, you know, this does present a little bit lighter package to carry around in the woods. Now, to give you a comparison of the bullets, see if I can get this into where you can see it. Here are some of the rounds. Now, this is a hand load here of this .357 Magnum. This is a 158 grain lead bullet here, and this is a bullet that I often carry in the woods when I carry a .357 Magnum. Here is the .41 Magnum, a 210 grain Winchester hollow point, and this is an old box of shells, and I think this chronographed right at 1470 or something feet per second, so pretty close to the 1500. And this is a .44 Magnum 240 grain hollow point, also Winchester, also kind of an older round. Gives you an idea of the size difference here. The look on them head on. Okay. Now let's talk about, once again, I always talk about this as a Magnum that never quite got off the ground. And I think it's because the guns that they manufactured. Now these guns right here represent excellent handguns for field use, okay, for hunting. All right, but it never really took off as a law enforcement round, and part of the reason I believe is because they used the N frame. Now I think they could have made an L frame, which they didn't have at that time, but they could have came out with an L frame to handle the 41 Magnum cartridge, especially in that 900 to 1,000 feet per second range, okay? And that would have made a much lighter round, okay? And that would have made a much more effective round. And if you think about it, law enforcement continued wanting a more powerful round into the 80s, where they adopted the 10 millimeter. The FBI adopted a 10 millimeter, and several police agencies were looking at it also and adopted it for a while. But they found that that was a little bit too powerful, and I've already done a video on some of the ballistics of the 10 millimeter. And once again, I think a lot of that has to do with the bullets themselves. The technology for bullets had not caught up with these more powerful rounds. You know, I think a 10 millimeter with some of the modern hollow points that they have today is an excellent defensive round, even in the more powerful ranges. And I believe the same would go for the 41 Magnum. The problem is there's not many manufacturers out there that are making bullets and making ammunition, I should say, in those ranges and in those types, looking at self-defense. The 41 Magnum these days has pretty much been relegated to a hunting or field cartridge, and I think that's a shame. But in these larger guns, and you know, Smith & Wesson wasn't the only ones. Ruger, well, they came out with their single action models in 41 Magnum rather quickly. And then later on, they came out with 41 Magnum and their Ruger Red Hawks. But once again, that was a very large frame gun, and I think it was specifically designed for the 44 Magnum, even though they made it in 41 Magnum and even 357 Magnum in the beginning. Okay, so the revolvers were never introduced, smaller, lighter weight revolvers that would be chambered in the 41 Magnum. Ammo companies never really took off with making a lot of self-defense ammunition for the 41 Magnum. So that kind of pushed it into a niche corner of being an outdoors or a field hunting cartridge. And I think that's the shame, because actually if you think about it, that caliber of bullet and that feet per second that they were wanting back in the early 60s, right, is what we have today with the 40 Smith & Wesson. So the search for that cartridge in that range, that caliber in that range, started a long time ago. Okay, and it took the development of the 10 millimeter and the shortcomings of not providing the training to control the 10 millimeter is how we got to the 40 Smith & Wesson, and that's probably one of the reasons why it is such a valuable and often used police cartridge and self-defense cartridge. But the 41 Magnum is an excellent, excellent, excellent cartridge in my opinion. Now you could always hand load, and you can still buy bullets that would be very effective for defense, but I've always read that it's never advisable to do that. Okay, it's never advisable to hand load ammunition that you would use for defense. Okay, because it becomes a liability in a courtroom. Everybody can have their own opinions. That's what I've read, and that's what I've been taught in self-defense classes. So I kind of sort of take it that, you know, that's probably a pretty good idea. But can you imagine an L-framed Smith & Wesson, or maybe a GP100 frame Ruger in 41 Magnum with about a 950 grain bullet like a Spear Gold Dot? That would be an excellent, excellent self-defense cartridge in my opinion. All right, well, these are some of my thoughts on 41 Magnum I wanted to share with you. Again, this is my absolute favorite revolver cartridge. I have several guns in this caliber, and this is the reason that I became such a 10mm fan. The anticipation of a semi-automatic that had near 41 Magnum ballistics. Man, I was in love with the 10mm before I first got it. All right, folks, well, thanks a lot for watching. I do appreciate it. And remember to shoot straight on the range and in life. Thanks.